Ruth and Patrick, welcome to the Sisterhood.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, we've already said, Patrick, but we love your radio voice. You are just fun to listen to. So we need to have you talk a lot today. I'm loving it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll do my best.
Well, so tell us where you live and what you do.
Yeah, so we live in the Ann Arbor, Michigan area. We moved up here about 5 years ago. Ruth is actually from Ann Arbor. And so most of our marriage and ministry has been in the Ohio area. And so we crossed the state line into God's country, Michigan, about 5 years ago and live in Ann Arbor area. And we're part of a church plant. So we moved here to plant a church. So we've been in local church ministry for over 20 years now. And I've been married for 22, just celebrated 22 years.
Yeah. We have 4 kids.
Yep.
Our oldest is 18 and we have a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old. I always have to think really hard as I get down, I'm like, wait, 11 or 12 or
That's why I let you take the kids.
Right.
I know, because you start losing track.
That's
really
right.
do.
I'm doing well if I just remember their names, let alone their ages. So.
And we actually also are in online ministry, and about 10 years ago, I started a ministry for moms. Our kids were really little at that time. And I just honestly, I felt alone in motherhood. And I thought, I cannot be the only one that feels this way. And so it really, I feel like God really called me to start an online blog and ministry for moms. And so that was almost 10 years ago. And then from there, we started another blog for families. And then we started writing books. And it's just, wow, it's been a crazy ride. But we love online ministry and just the opportunity to reach people across the world, just over the internet. It's crazy.
I'm getting to use my radio voice. We started a podcast called Root Like Faith, not too long, just about 6 months ago. And so I am have the opportunity to sort of exercise that gift now. So.
Wow, that's a lot that you have on your plate. I mean, church planting that just takes everything in you.
It does,
and so I'm sure that has felt like an interesting dance between all this that you have going on.
Yeah. For sure. I grew up, my dad was a pastor, church planter. He planted 2 churches in Indiana and 1 in Iowa. And so I'd always dreamed about planting a church, and everybody I knew that had planted a church tried to talk me out of it.
Yeah.
And so I can see why now, but no, it has been, even though it has been incredibly challenging, difficult, it's also been the most rewarding 4 or 5 years of our lives. And just so grateful for the families that packed up and moved their families and homes to come be a part of a new church here in Ann Arbor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that has to feel really important when people have that much trust in you to move their entire families. Like that's really
scary.
Beautiful. Yeah, and scary on your end.
Yeah, you kind of have to just keep surrendering that. Lord, you've called these people,
Yeah,
so.
I remember sitting down with each of the couple. We had about 5 or 6 couples that moved up here with us, and they, were praying through that. And I said, make sure you're following Jesus and not me.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, it is. You always, as a pastor, feel responsible for those that you're leading, but you feel especially responsible when they make that kind of sacrifice. So we're grateful to have been surrounded by just a lot of great friends and family.
Yeah. Well, and then something really big and important happened during that time as well. So can you tell us about your cancer diagnosis at age 43?
Yeah. So we were, like we were saying, we were in the middle of getting this church sort of off the ground. We had just launched. I mean, our first public service was in April of 2017. And it wasn't too long after that. I guess it was November of 2018 then, where I just knew something was wrong with my body. I mean, I'm over the age of 40, so it doesn't take much, I sleep and injure my neck, those kinds of things. So I was, used to sort of normal aches and pains and fatigue, all of this, but there was just something different. I knew something was wrong. And I had gotten an ear infection that would not heal. That was sort of the first sign. Started to notice, some chronic pain in my wrist and my spine. And then in November of 2018, I injured my left hip, not once, but twice. And, by God's grace, I did that. The specialist told me, had I not injured my hip, they would have not found the cancer until maybe it was too late. And so, in November,
it wasn't
happened.
Cancer related?
It was. I didn't know it at the time, but I had injured my hip and actually fractured my hip.
Oh.
and the cancer had compromised the strength of my
Mhm.
bones. And so my bones were just more brittle. And so I didn't know it at the time. I just thought I had a fractured hip. And so that was really the series of scans and MRIs. They noticed a lesion deep in my hip socket, and through lab work, then in December and then January, finally got that call that it was a type of blood cancer. And so that's kind of how that came about. And so we had really just started the church. We're kind of just getting the church off the ground, and then we found ourselves
Yeah.
in the middle of a really, really scary dark season, in the middle of a storm.
Mhm.
And so that's how that diagnosis came about. I got the phone call. We had just picked up our oldest son, Tyler, who, was with a friend of his at a homeschool co-op they were involved in. And we had just picked them up, and we were driving home. Ruth was driving, and I was in the
Mhm.
passenger side seat, and the nurse called. And so I was looking all around in our van, and I found the only scrap piece of paper I could find and began to write down this word I'd never heard of. And it was a word that we would unfortunately learn all too much about. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Ruth, what was that like for you?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, even we've talked about this so many times, but every time the details are, come to the surface, you're like, oh, wow, that was hard. um,
Mhm.
it was shocking. I mean, you're like, this cannot be happening. This can't be real. This cannot be a part of our story. We don't have time for this. I mean, the things that go through your head, especially, obviously we shared all the different areas of ministry that we are in. And when something like this comes into your life, it's such a disruption to what you feel. But I'm doing all these things that I feel called to do. I don't have time for this, and I
Mhm.
think so. There's so many emotions that go along with it, but I would say probably the biggest emotion is just shock, and you just feel ill, really. You just cannot even believe that this is a part of your story, or that this is happening to you. Especially just being in ministry, we've seen so many people walk through really hard things, and we've been a part of their lives and helped them through it. But it's like, then it comes to you and you're like, wait a second, like, wow, then it's real,
Yeah.
when it's your thing to carry.
Yeah, I
Yep.
think that's a good point, that a lot of us who are part of church communities or even work in ministry as our jobs, we're
Mhm.
used to being the ones that help.
Right.
And we're
Right.
used to being the ones that come and coordinate and care and do all of that. So when the tables shift, all of a sudden it's this role reversal. And I'm sure that feels strange. How did
Yeah.
your church, here you are part of this new church community of committed people, how did they respond to you and to your family when this happened?
Yeah. Well, there's no better family,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, to belong to than the church. When I was diagnosed, we waited about 2 days to tell our kids, and we watched some Hallmark movies, and did some things to kind of distract ourselves. And I had to wait 8 days to see the specialist, but we waited 2 days to tell our kids. And so we were in shock. It felt like chaos. And I remember sitting our kids down, kind of worked up the courage, and prayed through what we were going to tell the kids. And I told the kids three things. I told them, number one, God is good no matter what. Number two, God's going to use this in our lives. He's going to grow you. He's going to grow us. He's going to grow our church. But the third thing I said is watch the church. And sorry, what I meant by that is I wanted our kids to watch the way the
Mhm.
church loved us, prayed for us, had faith for us at times when we didn't have faith ourselves, worship for us. And so, our kids got to see that. I want our kids to love Jesus, but I also want our kids to grow up to love the church.
Mhm.
And our church family was just incredible. We had so many people that were a part of that original core group that just rallied around us. And they would come and they cleaned, our house when I was, in the hospital for my stem cell transplant. And they gave gifts to our kids and gave us gift cards. I mean, all kinds of just practical things that they did to really love us. We had a worship night where they read scripture, over us
Mhm.
and prayed for us. And so there were just so many ways. And it was, to your point, that as a pastor, I've been so for 20 years, I'd been the one carrying other people on a
Mm.
stretcher. And really for the first time in my life and my first time in my ministry, I was the one on the stretcher. And, so we had a church family that was digging through the rough and lowering us, at the feet of Jesus, to use that biblical, picture or passage. And they did that, and they still do that for us. And so we're just so grateful for the way that the church really was able to be the church for us and to be a family to us and to love on us. And so it was by far the most challenging time of our marriage and ministry, but the church was so good to us during that season.
Yeah. And I think that there was so much for us to learn about the church in that season, and that we had, like you said, helped people who were on a stretcher for so long, but there was so much we didn't understand because we hadn't, you don't really know until you've been through something. And I think, that was the one thing we kept saying to each other, oh my word, like if we would have only known how this felt, really felt, how differently maybe we would have, handled situations with other people, or just been more sympathetic to what they were going through. So I can see that side of it as well, that God really used it in our lives to help us understand the people of our church better as well.
I mean, Ruth is so right. I think that's one of the things suffering trials do is they don't always, suffering is no guarantee that it's going to change you. There's plenty of people that walk through difficult things and they become bitter, resentful, consumed with their own suffering. But it's who we turn to, right, in the midst of our suffering. That is what has the power to change us or transform us. And I think when we do that, I mean, that's one of the great gifts that God gives us is a softer heart for other people, a more tender heart. And I'm laughing when you say that, because I just think, oh, if I could go back 10 years in my ministry, knowing what I know now and have experienced, what we've experienced now, I would be such a better pastor. So, I think I remember my sister, she had breast cancer a number of years ago. And I remember calling her and going, I am so sorry.
Right.
I had no idea what you were walking through. And so I think that there's that part of it as a pastor, that when you walk through that as a pastor's wife, it just gives you a whole new level of love and concern for those that you are shepherding and taking care of. And so we're grateful for that, the way that God has just continued to soften our own hearts for the people that God's entrusted to us.
Yeah. It's really beautiful. And so many people don't have that experience with the church. And so I think it's really encouraging, actually, to hear, and exciting to hear that the church can rise in that way. But I'm wondering a little bit about a crisis of faith, because here you are stepping out to church plant, you feel like you're doing God's work, and then this happens. Talk to us a little bit about what that little bit of crisis or rub and tension felt like for you.
Yeah, I think, when any trial that you walk through, any kind of suffering you face or pain you encounter, I think I think you see that, the book that we wrote, In a Boat in the Middle of a Lake, is really built on Mark 4, that story of Jesus going out, taking the disciples from teaching them by the lake to teaching them in the middle of the lake. And when that storm hits, they have exactly what you're talking about, that crisis of faith, where they begin to not so much question God's existence, but they question God's character. And that's a huge difference. And I don't know that we ever questioned God's existence, but there were moments where, like, okay, God, like this isn't the way it's supposed to work. And you begin sometimes to question God's goodness or his faithfulness or his love. And so I think, for us, when we found ourselves in that place, when we found ourselves in a boat in the middle of a lake, it was more of that kind of crisis of faith. It was more like, okay, God, do I really believe that you're good? And do I really believe that you love me? Do I really believe that your promises are true? And so I think in that way, the crisis that comes, right? I mean, doubt, when we hit trials or suffering, it can either lead to despair or greater devotion. I think that's one of the things that as we turn to God and we keep turning to him, that it increases our faith. And sometimes it exposes what we don't really believe. We said we believed that God is good or faithful. I preached certain things when I was safely on the shore. But when you get out in the middle of the lake and the storm begins to come around you, and you're not sure whether you've got a year, 2 years, 5 years, you're not sure whether this is going to mean your wife is going to spend the rest of her life by herself, or she's going to get remarried, or your kids are going to, walk down the graduation aisle by themselves, all of those things, it does really begin to bring to the surface what you really believe about who God is. And I think that's one of the great gifts of suffering, is it brings to the surface what we really believe and what we don't yet believe. and there comes a choice, right? And in every suffering that we face, there's a choice in that of really beginning to identify those things that
Mhm.
we need to believe more deeply and ask God for grace in.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of people, I mean, I've heard a lot of people say to me, wow, you must have such big faith. And I think we just assume that people that walk through things like this just have some like, this incredible faith, and we don't see in the real struggle that it is, and we don't normalize that. You know what I mean? Like, it's okay when you're suffering to really struggle and question and doubt, and it's a day by day struggle to trust that God has your best interest in mind, right? And I think it's okay that we say that, and we recognize that, yeah, there is this crisis, and it's going to be day after day after day. And for even the people that you see that you think, oh my word, these are like heroes and giants of the faith, they struggle with those same things, and I think if we can normalize that, there's such relief that comes with that, knowing that, wow, I really have to, this is a battle. I have to battle through this. I have to keep turning to God. I have to keep trusting him, trusting that he'll take care of me. And I think that, when Pat talked about just trusting God's character, a verse that really helped me through the last few years is Psalm 9:10, which says, those who know your name trust in you, for you have never forsaken those whose heart is steadfast on you. And it's that beginning that says, those who know your name trust in you. And that for me was that I knew God's name. I knew his character. I knew that he was faithful. I knew that he was merciful. I knew that he was the healer. Like, I knew these things about him because I had spent time with him. And because I knew his character, I could trust him even through something as awful as this.
Can you talk? So, in this series, we're talking about leaving your mark. And I think when we hear that phrase, we're really talking about, like, how do you live in such a way that your mark outlasts you? Because I think when you face a diagnosis like you faced, Patrick, that you come face to face with your mortality in a really
Mhm.
real way. Because I
Yeah.
think, and COVID has done that for
Yeah.
people. I think they really have come face to face with the fact that these bodies won't last,
Right.
and we
Yeah.
don't know if we're guaranteed tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting concept to see trial as a way to leave your mark. That's
Mm.
not really a path that we want. It's not a path that we think that trial can be a way that actually we leave a little bit of a lasting legacy. But can you speak to that, about how trial can actually be a part of leaving your mark in the
Yeah,
world?
no, that's so good. I think you're so right. And yeah, I remember one of the first phone calls I made when we got back to the house is I called both of my sisters, and one of my sisters said to me, she said, "All eyes are on you." Now, that doesn't sound like encouragement, but it
Sounds
was.
like a
And
lot
what
of
it
pressure.
sounds like
Yeah,
right now.
exactly. Everybody's watching.
But she said all eyes, and what she meant by that is that you've been a pastor now for at that time it was 18, almost 18 years, and she said you've preached about who Jesus is, and you've led other people, but now people are going to be watching you. And I had a similar friend. One of the other phone calls I made was to a mentor of mine. His name is Michael Spencer. He's a stage 4 throat cancer survivor, and he said a very similar thing. He said, you only get one chance to tell your kids. And again, he wasn't trying to put pressure on. He was just reminding me that we have a choice in the midst of suffering and pain and trials to steward that suffering well.
Mhm.
And those two voices in my life on that day, within the first hour, 2 hours of my diagnosis, I think God really used that to give us a perspective that if Jesus loved me in my suffering, which you look at the cross, if Jesus loved me in that painful, sacrificial, bloody, dirty, painful way, Jesus, I'm going to love you in my suffering.
Mhm.
And so I think the challenge then for the believer, for the follower of Jesus, is to go, more than just leaving a mark. I want to be obedient to you. When I look at the scriptures, the men and women who left a mark weren't so much trying to leave a mark as much as they were just trying to be obedient and be faithful in the midst of whatever circumstances they were in. And so I think about Hebrews chapter 11, that great chapter of faith, and they left a legacy, right? They left a mark. None of them were necessarily trying to leave a mark, but it was their faithfulness in the midst of suffering, in the midst of trials, sometimes they saw God come through in victorious ways, and sometimes they were sawed in half, sometimes they were killed.
Mm.
And so whether they saw God come through or whether it cost them their life, Hebrews 11 is all about a people that were being faithful, and they hadn't yet received what it was that they saw from a distance, what had been promised. And so I think that as we think about that, as your listeners, whatever suffering they're in the midst of, like, that's the goal, is to go, God, you have loved me and have saved me through the work of Jesus. You loved me in your suffering. And so now how do I steward this suffering, whatever it is? If it's a miscarriage, it's a child that has walked away from the faith, it's financial insecurity, it's health. God, how do I love you back and love those around you? And how do I be faithful to you in the midst of my circumstances? I think those are the people that leave the mark, leave the legacy. And I think we've tried to do that first and foremost with that audience right in front of us, our family. And certainly we hope we were able to do that with our church family, just to model what it looks like to continue being faithful to Jesus and to steward what it is that he's asked us to walk through.
And then I think with, as we continue to share our story through suffering, it is an invitation for other people that are going through pain and trials. Our vulnerability almost gives them permission to join in that, to walk alongside us, for us to walk alongside them. I mean, our book, In a Boat in the Middle of a Lake, is really a guide for people that are going through suffering. And we have really, it's been incredible to see, and heartbreaking as well, to see the amount of people, just even online, because we can see the response, and people are, they're audibly responding to us. Just there's so much that people are going through. And so already we can see the impact of us. Who wants to, I don't have the personality where I'd like to tell you all about all the hard things I'm going through. That's just not
Right.
me. I'm like, who wants to have to do that? Right. It's so hard. But I see how God is being glorified in it, and how really it's bringing hope to people who felt so hopeless. So I think there's that aspect of, leaving your mark is really just giving, helping other people feel like they can have faith and they can hope, and you can keep pointing them to God with what you've been through.
Yeah, I love that you brought up Hebrews 11. And I've always been struck by, these are our heroes of the faith, but they didn't know they were heroes.
Right,
I mean, they
exactly.
didn't know they were.
Yep.
And they didn't know the far-reaching ramifications of their faithfulness.
Right, absolutely.
And they didn't know, and that is what makes faith. And I say this all the time, but it's so obvious, but if we knew the outcome, it wouldn't be faith.
Yeah.
And so it actually is that not knowing that makes it faith. And that is what God loves, right?
Yeah,
Is that,
yeah.
it says throughout scripture that God, he responds when people rise in faith,
Yeah.
and that he loves our faith. And so I just think that's so beautiful, the way that you explained that, and that it's not so much trying to leave a mark, just like in Hebrews 11, they didn't know they were going to
Yeah.
be heroes of the faith, but it's just in their faithfulness and walking a faithful life, they actually are leaving a mark.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a good word for us.
Yeah. No, I think it's challenging too, because we live in such a, like, who doesn't want to live a meaningful life or leave a mark? And it's sometimes, you mentioned earlier, just with a diagnosis, I've used the language of feeling like, time has edges for me. And I always knew that I wasn't going to live forever, but you don't really believe that. And you get busy with life. And yet when you get a diagnosis, now the end of your life comes a little bit closer, and you start to see the edge of your life. And so I think with that, you begin to look at what kind of legacy are you leaving? And you begin to focus and pay attention to what you're investing in. And that can be challenging sometimes, because you're like, oh boy, I hope I really am leaving that mark or that legacy. And just that reminder, I think, of just taking that next step of obedience, of being faithful to God wherever it is that he has you. I think it was Brennan Manning who said, trust is our gift back to God. And so we just give that gift of our trust, our faith in God, and let him, we surrender the outcomes to him. And so such a challenging thing to do, but so necessary.
I've got a question. So I was listening to a podcast by John Mark Comer the other day he was explaining this concept of the truly mature person integrates all of their experience into reality, that actually we have to fully face reality in
Mm,
order to be truly mature. So we have to take all of our background, all of our personality, right? All of those things, but also all of our suffering and hardship and trials. And we have to face it full on in order for that maturity to come. Can you talk to me a little bit about maybe your process in that and how you came? Because it's hard to face really hard and your mortality. It's hard to face things really head on and let that integrate into all of who you are. Can
Yeah.
you speak a little bit to that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the challenging things of being a pastor and having to
mm,
get up. I went through 5 months of what they call frontline treatment. And so that was a weekly injection, oral chemotherapy, and then that was followed by 2 stem cell transplants. I did a stem cell transplant in July of 2018, came home, rested, recovered for 60 days, did that all over again. I was in the hospital 35 days, between July and those, I think, guess July through October. And for those first 5 months, having to get up and preach. I mean, I preached almost every Sunday,
mm,
and so I was trying to process all of those things. I was trying to come to grips with my mortality. I was thinking about, again, my kids. I was thinking about the church, and all of those things. And so, one of the things we write about in the book is that we kind of have this, depending on what church background you come from, we sort of have this church culture where honesty, lamenting is not always welcome.
mm,
And so I think one of the things that we did, and other people in the church helped us with that, is we tried to create a culture where it was okay to be honest. And we talk about that in the book, that an honest spirituality is a healthy spirituality. And I think for me personally, I mean, grieving that, I mean, being, I didn't know I was grieving at the time, but entering into that pain, we enter pain suddenly, but we need to move through it slowly. And so I think I went through a process of counseling, and that looked, different. I had several counselors in my life that were helping me process that, and still are. And so that has been really good. And so I just think that it is so important for somebody not to live in denial. And I think as Christians, sometimes we create this culture that if you have doubts, if you're weeping or lamenting, that means you don't really have faith. And yet when you read the scriptures, a third of the Psalms are lamentations. They're cries of sorrow. They're
mhm.
questioning God. Yeah, the whole book of Lamentations is just that. It's a lament. And so I think that's such an important part of the journey of being a disciple, being a follower of Jesus, is learning to enter into those very real experiences, those real emotions, and not surrendering to them, not bowing to them, but taking those to God. The Psalms are great in that way, that they tell us how we should feel. And so we come to God honest, but the Psalms have a way of correcting our emotions and helping us. They right size them. And so I think we need an honest
Mhm.
spirituality if we're going to have a healthy spirituality.
Yeah, I think it was as he's sharing that, I'm thinking about how many times, he preached through that whole thing. And I think it was
I think I
so
cried in every sermon, by the way, that
Oh, yeah,
well,
of
he is a little
course.
bit emotional
I grew up with two
anyways,
older sisters, so
so
it's nothing spiritual.
but I think it was so good. Again, I'm coming from the perspective of I particularly like to show my vulnerability and cry, but like in that, what else are you going to do, right? And I think it was so good I remember even telling him, because he'd be like, oh my word, it was hard to get up and preach, and you're in the depths, I mean,
Mhm.
really. But I think it was so good for people, I know for me and for other people in our church, to walk through that. There was such a depth to it, honestly, um, to really be able to walk with you through that suffering. I think it was probably healthy for you too, even though it was really hard, because you really were facing your emotions head on. And we were all in that with you. But
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
there were a lot of Sundays I didn't want to preach. I would have much
right.
rather have just crawled underneath the chair, and so our church was so gracious in that
Mhm.
they were just very patient with me and gracious, and there was a long leash there, and they certainly gave me permission. I think as a pastor, to be able to be vulnerable in that way, to share in that way. But yeah, there were a lot of messy Sundays, those first 5-6 months, and even when I came back. And so our people were so good, and I think that has been something unique about our church, is that we've really created that culture, where it's okay to do that. That may have been a longer answer than you wanted, but that's
No, it's great. And I just think that's real, right? And so in a lot of ways that allows people to walk with you in that whole, Brene Brown research on vulnerability, that actually vulnerability creates intimacy. And
Right.
so you being vulnerable and getting up every week, I'm sure in a way, it built your church. It built who your church was becoming, was a place where you could be that and do that, and you could come together. And so in a very backwards, beautiful way, it was building the strength of your church at that time. As I'm hearing you talk, that's really interesting. And what an interesting, not that God wanted this journey necessarily for you, but using it in your church plant.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that phrase you used with your kids of watch the church,
Right.
that people were doing that with each other and they were doing that with you, that you were modeling that, but they were modeling it back to you. That all seems very, not just healthy, but it makes faith relevant, because for so many people that are turned off by church, it's because the honesty isn't there, or they feel like, no, my pain is too much. Maybe Christ can cover your multitude of sins, but those are minor compared to mine.
Right.
The things that I bring, or the grief that I bring, it's just too much. And so to have a church that says, no, this is come and bring it all, is, I would think, very refreshing to people who maybe haven't seen that or heard that before.
No, I think you're right. I think we use that very similar language, that we just felt like that we were, we came back from transplant. I came back from my second transplant and started preaching again right around Christmas. It was right around December of that year, and probably too soon in hindsight. I don't think I was ready physically or emotionally, but I came back and started preaching again. And we did use that language of just feeling like this is a whole new foundation, as we're almost replanting now, because I thought we were done. It felt like the wheels were coming off. And, sorry, I'm emotional because God has been so good, and we've seen God show up in so many ways. And when we thought the wheels were coming off, God was just doing some amazing things. And by God's grace, we were really, rebuilding on a new, a better foundation. And so I think you're exactly right. I mean, it was a heavy season. It was a challenging season. We've since partnered with another church, but we still have our church is still a campus. And so it really did, I think, create a unique culture that I think is really, really healthy and refreshing.
Yeah. So tell us, can you give us an update on your health right now?
Yeah, so I am 2 years in remission. I guess they would consider that remission or a complete response. So I had that second stem cell transplant in October of 2018. And so we're just over 2 years. And again, by God's grace, there's no visible signs of cancer in my body. I continue to take maintenance medication, and probably will the rest of my life, to hopefully keep that cancer under control or at bay. But we're driving on, and grateful for just the continued good reports. I go in every 2 months for pretty extensive lab work. And that lab work has really not changed, since October 2018. So
wow, that is
driving on.
incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, we're
That is
very
incredible.
very thankful for
What
that.
kind of cancer is it?
It's a blood cancer called multiple myeloma.
Oh
And
yeah.
so it's typically a blood cancer that affects women over the age of 65. And so in case those that are listening can't tell, or I'm neither one of those.
Right.
And so I'm in a unique category, to say the least. And it's usually the result of some kind of environmental exposure for an extended amount of time, which is why people usually don't get it till they're nearing the 70s, 80s.
Mhm.
Did
So
you
I'm in
know
a
what that
unique.
exposure was for you?
We have no idea. And so it's one of those mysteries, that it could have been somewhere we lived. It could have been something we had in our home, could have been something we
Well, it was probably
eaten,
when
but
you were younger, they
right.
said. Yeah.
Yep. So
Wow.
we don't, yeah. And so it's one of those things, I think for me, with the type of diagnosis and who it generally affects. I think everybody that's diagnosed with cancer always asks the question, how long do I have? And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
um, I think
Yeah.
that's what makes this diagnosis. I remember asking him that. He's like, I have no idea. And because it behaves so differently in different people's bodies, and because all of the statistics out there, when you just said, stay off the internet, all of the statistics on the internet are generally being collected by people 65, 70, 80 years old. And so that even in itself has been something that God has just used to go, I don't know, I can't point to a statistic. And I
Mm.
remember Ruth and I, we would go walk after my stem cell transplant, and we would talk. We would basically have the same conversation over and over again. I would talk about it,
Yeah.
and she would listen with the patience of Jesus.
Mhm.
Yeah, right.
And one day I remember her, I could tell you exactly where we were at in the neighborhood. And um, she essentially said, you're looking for a statistic, and what you need is trust. And I think has been just that constant reminder of, we just have to surrender, like you said,
Mhm.
nobody has a guarantee of tomorrow or the next day. And so with this diagnosis in particular, I think for me, it's just been that daily reminder to surrender whatever days God, will graciously give me,
Mhm.
to him.
Mm. That's
I think
beautiful,
that's,
Ruth, what you said.
yeah, and so applicable to people now,
Mm.
regardless of what kind of suffering they're going through. For so many people, the future feels unknown,
Yeah.
right? Going into 2021, we
Mm.
don't know what our jobs are going to look like, what our health is going to look like, what if our kids are going to be able to do the things that we would like them to be able to do. And so we've developed this new understanding and appreciation of the unknown and living
Mm.
in the unknown, which we always have. And you always did, but
Right.
it
Yep.
wasn't until you had this diagnosis that you had to come to terms with the fact that you really don't know. And I
Right.
think with the pandemic and with so many other things that are happening right now, people are faced with this lack of certainty. And so
Mhm.
we can go one direction with that, or we can go towards God with that and
Right.
say, I'm going to have to trust you. This is the choice factor of
Mm.
my faith right now, is trusting in the unknown. And so I think your story is very timely from a
Mhm.
global
Yeah.
perspective,
Yep.
Mm.
that even though it is your own particular story of the unknown and suffering, that it's very relatable to
Yeah.
people. And I think will be very relatable to our listeners, regardless of their
Mm.
circumstances, because everybody is going through something right now
That's right.
that makes them question the future.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And we're all in the middle of the lake.
Yep.
And
Mm.
Yeah.
so I'm so grateful that your book is coming out right now.
Yeah. I
Mm.
wish we could say we planned that.
Well,
Yeah.
someone might have.
Somebody might
Yeah,
have. That's right.
right.
That's right. No, that is so
Well,
true. That's good.
what would you leave the listeners with today? What are a few words from both of you of encouragement for people who do feel like they're in the Mark IV story right now in the middle of the lake?
Yeah. Actually, the what he said that I said to him sounds so like spiritual, right? Like what you're
It
looking
was,
for is a
honey. Yeah.
statistic, but you just need to trust. But I remember when we were going through all the treatments and everything, and I remember like just scrambling through my Bible for just some word of hope, and I think if you can picture that, like picture me just, and I would say that I'm probably the more optimistic person. I definitely faith comes easier to me, but nothing can prepare you for what those trials that you face that kind of knock you off your feet. And if you can just picture me, even somebody who would say, yeah, I have a really, strong faith. And I scrambled through the scriptures just looking for hope. And I remember a friend of mine who was going through a really hard time one time, sitting down and looking at me and saying, I'm looking for God and I can't find him anywhere. And
Mm.
I told her, don't stop looking. He is there. And so that when I think about myself scrambling through those scriptures, I was looking for his word, for his hope, anything. And I would just encourage the listener not to give up. The same thing that I said to her applies to you. Don't stop looking for him. He is there. Keep looking for him. Keep looking in his word, because his hope is there in his word.
That's such a good word, Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just, I think one of the things that God has been teaching me, and this is going to sound so simple, it's going to sound so basic, but I would encourage those that are listening that have found themselves in a boat in the middle of a lake, to remember is that they're loved. And I know that sounds so simple, it sounds so basic, it sounds so Sunday School 101, but when you know you're loved, you can walk through anything. And this is why preaching for 5 months was so painful for our church, because I would be awkward like this in Christ. So I apologize, but
Oh gosh, it's just real. This
when I
is
think
hard.
about when I think about the Garden of Gethsemane and Jesus there in his dark night of the soul, if you will, what made him be able to say, "Not my will." But your will be done, was that he knew he was loved by the Father. He had heard those words spoken over him at his baptism, right? He comes up out of the water, the skies are ripped open, and the Holy Spirit descends on him like a dove, and the voice of his Father says, "This is my son, whom I love, and with whom I'm well pleased," and a very public affirmation of his authority and who he is. And so Jesus knew that he was loved by the Father. And so what enabled Jesus in the garden to be able to say, "Not my will, but your will be done," was he knew that he was loved. And I know that sounds so simple. I know that sounds so basic, but I would just encourage those that are listening or watching, that whatever suffering they found themselves in, to remember that their comfort or lack thereof is not commentary on God's character. It's not commentary on God's love. And he is good, he is faithful, and he is with you in the midst of that storm. He is the one who speaks to the storm. He's the Lord over your chaos. He is the God who suffered for you. There is no hope but Jesus, crucified, resurrected, now reigning, and one day returning. And he really is going to wipe away every tear. He is really going to renew and restore all things. And as the scriptures say, there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. We come from him and we'll return to him. And there's nothing that can possibly separate us from that love. And so I know that sounds so basic. It's so simple, but when you know you're loved, you can walk through anything. And so I would just encourage those that are watching or listening to remember that they are loved, whether they feel loved or not.
No, it's not basic and it's not simple. It's actually, I think, one of the hardest truths that we really internalize in our life. And it literally has the most profound transformational impact when actually that really sinks into our souls. And so I think it's exactly the most beautiful word, just to leave our listeners with that today in this story. And that as you live loved, then you can trust and walk in faith. And kind of bringing it full circle of our whole conversation. When you feel that love, we know the end of our story. And so we can then go out in trust, no matter what tomorrow brings. And your story is such a beautiful example of that. Thank you for writing that book. I just really want to encourage all of our listeners, if you are walking through a storm, this is the resource for you. This is the resource. And so thank you both for coming on, for sharing your story, for your tears, for your authenticity and your realness. I mean, this is the stuff of life, and we need people who are willing to step into it with us. So thank you both for being two of those people.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
All right. Well, we wish you the very best. And Patrick, we are so glad you are well, and we pray that you will continue to stay well.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
God bless you guys.